Welcome to episode 2. I am Jen Blush. If you don't know me, I'm officially the moderator for this episode. Don't know how I was bestowed this wonderful role. So this is episode 2 of Course Studies, a showcase of teaching practices and principles. Very exciting. And so I will just introduce one of you and feel free to tell us a little bit about yourself. So the first one is Dr. Leslie Berntsen.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. So I teach courses at the University of Southern California in the Department of Psychology. I've been a teaching faculty member this is my 3rd year. I teach primarily introduction to psychology and abnormal psych, and then sometimes development as well. But no matter which course I'm teaching, like the overarching theme is that it's going to be very social justice focused in terms of how can we apply the content we're learning to make our own lives better, to make the world a little bit better than it was the day before, whatever that might mean to you, because that's such a broad statement. It means so many things to so many people, but I want to try and give people, my students, as many options as they can possibly have to achieve that goal. I'm also super active in STP, so we'll do a shameless plug for the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, where I'm on the diversity committee and also chairing a new award that they have. So if the things that we talk about are super relevant to the work that you do, we have a new Promoting DEI award for the teaching of psychology. And that is where I will end my shameless plug and let Molly go.
Awesome. Yeah, so our second instructor that we recruited for this episode is Dr. Molly Metz.
Hi, thank you. I'm an assistant professor teaching stream at the University of Toronto. I am starting my 4th year there. It's my 6th year teaching full-time. And in addition to upper level social psychology courses like close relationships, intergroup relations, emotion, sex and gender, I also, most of them know me for teaching our giant required stats courses. So almost everyone in the major comes through me in one of our 200-person stats courses at some point in their training. So it's an interesting balance, right? I get students who definitely don't want to be there and students who love to be there, depending on which class I'm teaching.
Absolutely. That's awesome. And so then, of course, we have our esteemed and lovely panel members here as well with us. And I don't know if you all want to introduce yourselves again. I know we did on episode 1, but we have Dr. Bob Dubois and Dr. Sierra Kidder.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Bob Dubois. I'm at the University of Tennessee. Can you tell? And I'm the Associate Director of Undergraduate Studies and a lecturer.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sierra Kidder at Marian University in Wisconsin. I'm an assistant professor of psychology. I mostly teach stats in intro psych and social.
Awesome. And me again, your lovely host for this evening. I am Dr. Jen Blush. I'm the cognitive psychology professor at William Peace University in Raleigh, North Carolina. So very exciting. So I think if we're all ready, we can just sort of jump right in. So I think I decided to, and Sierra gave some input on this, to organize the episodes thematically. So unless folks really just want to go first, I figured we could organize it according to like policies that are inclusive, and then some content focused stuff, and then some assignments. Everyone's cool with that?
Sounds good. Order? I love that. As I'm looking at the notes I took when I was thinking about the things to talk about, that's exactly how I divided my notes. So okay. We are right on.
Awesome. So then I know, Molly, you had some policy verbiage that in your syllabus. So if you want to share that with us, go for it.
Yeah. So first, just to kind of zoom back a little bit, when we were first talking about what you wanted to talk about during this episode, we talked about, the really kind of reckoning that we've all had in the past few months about how much more we can and should be doing in our classes and in our programs regarding anti-racism and social justice. But we're also just talking about ways that we aim to be inclusive and accessible to all of our students, regardless of social group or identity or experience with academia and things like that. And so I have some things that I've been trying to do for a long time and some things that I'm trying to do new as I am trying to grow and change with the times and for my students as well. So one thing that I have been doing for a few years is I have a life happens insurance policy in my syllabus. And exactly what that is going to depend on the class, but it's my way of telling them explicitly that I recognize that everybody has terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days, and that is okay, and that shouldn't be a reason for them to fail. Right. So depending on the course, I'll typically have, a lot of low stakes assessments, and 1 or 2 or 3 is dropped. So in stats, they have weekly homework, but the top 10 of 13 are graded. Again, no questions asked, no justification required. I also offer what used to be a 24-hour late ticket and is now a 48-hour late ticket that they can use for one assignment at one point in the term. Again, no documentation required, no questions asked. I've gotten a lot of gratitude for these policies, more than I think I deserve, because just offering this kind of flexibility, I guess, is so unfamiliar to a lot of them, especially in the lower level, large enrollment courses. And I feel like this is the minimum I can do for them, but they really appreciate just hearing someone in a position of power say shit happens and that's okay.
Exactly. Would you be able to share some of your syllabus verbiage with us if you have that?
Yeah, so the part that I wanted to share with you, I actually shamelessly stole from Leslie earlier this year when I was planning for my new courses for the fall. So after all of the language about if you're having a bad day, let me know, and I need this note or this justification or whatever, now my syllabus also includes this language. It says, please do not feel like you need to perform or share your trauma in order to get the support you need. I do need to know when you're struggling and need some extra help, but you don't need to share any private details in order to qualify for a discussion of alternative arrangements. In Canada, especially, I've learned that they very, very highly prioritize privacy. And so our university has our accessibility services set up in such a way so that we don't know anything about the nature or the reason for accommodations, and we get just the accommodation letter, which is awesome. It's in an effort to have students treated equally across all their classes, regardless of the inclinations of their professors. But sometimes students need a little extra help and they don't have those accommodations registered. And this is my way of saying, even if you don't have this formally registered with this office, you can let me know, but you don't have to tell me anything that you're not comfortable with as well. And I loved that language when I saw it in a syllabus that Leslie shared with me, and so shamelessly swiped it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. That was great. And I feel like I need to adopt something. I have something like that, but I feel like I need to make that more explicitly stated like you have. So that's great.
Well, and I think that that's part of it, right? Is a lot of us have these feelings or desires for our students, but the more explicit we can be, I know that things happen, I think they really, really appreciate.
Absolutely. Leslie, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, please. So just adding on to that, I think it's also important because I think we're kind of preaching to the choir a little bit right now, right? Which is great and awesome. But I also think it's important to kind of speak to the people who might be hearing this and be like, oh, is that my job or not? So I have things to say about that. So a pretty common, and maybe all of you have heard this in some form or fashion, maybe you've heard a colleague say something to the effect of, I'm not a therapist, right? It seems to be a pretty common line. And my feelings on that specific line is I get the impression that a lot of people use it in order to basically absolve themselves of basic human empathy, rather than use it as a statement to acknowledge their professional limitations. So factually, I am not a therapist. That is a factual statement. So I will say that to students, and I will say, you know what, to be clear, I am not a clinician. And even if I were, this would not be inappropriate for me to act in that role, right? But that being said, I can still care about you as a person and turn you over to someone who can effectively help you. And I think that distinction is a really important one to make, because are we therapists? The vast majority of us? No. But even if we are, that would still be a problem, right? So acknowledging that we want to care about our students as people. And consistently, just to echo what Molly said, time and time and time again, students are so surprised by this in a way that honestly makes me so angry, because what I'm doing should not be special. I'm showing you what I consider to be basic decency, and it's a problem to me that they've been treated in so many of these other just awful, horrendous, sometimes illegal ways, and just expected to like brush that off. So I think that's important to explicitly like throw out there.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, that was a great little mini policy session. That was great. And so then if we are ready, I know Leslie, you wanted to share some content related stuff with us. And she's going to ask us to participate in a couple parts. So just letting everyone know.
Yes, I do. So let me see. I am the personification of the professor with a PhD who can't figure out the most basic aspects of technology necessary to do her job, is what I feel like on Zoom. So give me just a second, and let me see if I can do this in a way that
too, Leslie.
and you know what? I try for my people. Like I try, I really do. But you know what? Sometimes, man. Okay. So I have this, and I think this should work. All right. We can see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yes.
All right. So this comes from my material in social psychology when I teach intro. Because very often, I'm going to do another disclaimer, very often I hear when people teach intro psych especially is there is, I mean, it's no lie, there's so much content that needs to go into that class. And people who already feel overloaded might be like, what, I'm supposed to do like diversity too? And it's like, it's not that hard. I'm sorry. It's not that hard if you integrate it into the things you're already teaching, right? And I think that's also an important point to make rather explicitly. So that being said, belief in a just world, for those who might not be familiar, is a concept that's pretty, I mean, in most intro psych courses, granted I'm speaking from N of 1, my experience, but this is, I think, a fairly appropriate intro psych term, where basically it refers to the idea, and I'll walk you through it, refers to the idea that the world is a fundamentally good and just place. So the way I describe it to my students is it's almost like a really intense form of like cosmic or karmic justice as a way to think of it. And it's an individual difference variable. So people could score super, super high on their belief in a just world, or super low, or anywhere in between, right? So I walk them through the logic that underlies these beliefs, okay? So the world is a fundamentally good and just place. That means, following from that, that means that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Talking about karma again, that seems to resonate with people. That explanation of just world is like karma. So people get what they deserve and they deserve what they get. That means that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And like, I can see the light bulbs clicking out in the audience in the before times. Out in the audience, I see the light bulbs clicking like when I do this. So that being said, I'll pose all of you the question that I pose to my students. Following from all of this, if a bad thing happens to you, or a bad thing happens to someone, and you are a person who believes in a just world, complete that sentence. What does that mean? If a bad thing happens to you, then everyone
must be a bad person.
I must be a bad,
Thank
defective
you, Molly.
person.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Dr. Bob. Such good students. Thank you. Yeah. So you must be a good person then. And I let people sit with that for a moment. And they're like, oh, yeah, oh man, right? So then, doing a little more, thinking now that we've established what these beliefs are, if people, and again, framing it in a way that this is a deeply, deeply held belief about the way the world works, right? So when you have a belief, whatever you believe, that is that deeply held and that belief is threatened, you're going to want to do all the cognitive gymnastics in the world to make that belief true and right again, right? So if someone's belief in a just world is threatened, how might they respond and what might they do? They might derogate and or blame the victim, make them into the defective person. That was good language, Bob, thank you. To make them into the defective person might be one option. Another option is they might make excuses for and or humanize the perpetrator who has done something bad. They're not a bad person. They're a good person who just made an oopsie daisies, right? That kind of framing, okay? So then I set that all up. Again, this is pure content. This is all in the context of something you would learn in intro psych, right? I think I might have to take the screen away for just a second. Let me see what order I'm going in. Oh, that's fine, we'll do this. So I give them this example and say, all right, hey, so when you hear things like this out in the world and people say these things, these are the kind of beliefs that are lurking beneath the surface, right? If you say that someone should have made a better decision so that a crime does not happen to them, what the thinking underlying that is, if only they were a better person, this wouldn't have happened to them, right? And I emphasize that this kind of serves like a self-protective effects in a way, right? Where people want to convince themselves where if I were in that situation, I would have made the good decision and that wouldn't have happened to me, right? But that's in a hypothetical version of the world that doesn't really exist, right? So actually connecting the dots and saying, hey, when people victim blame, these are the kind of things that they might believe kind of beneath the surface. I also tie it to the Stanford case from a couple years ago. And I specifically choose this case to illustrate it because there was no doubt in this case, right? Like he did it and he was caught. So I choose that very deliberately because there is no room for false accusation this, false accusation that. He did it. And look at all of this press coverage that they got, that he got, framing him as an all-American swimmer who's, I can quote this by heart now, it's so sad, but basically he was an all-American swimmer whose future is now tarnished like a rusting trophy, and so on and so on and so on. And then I tie this to the real world connections to say, look at how this played out, all of this really sympathetic framing. Look how that played out in terms of the sentence. He is not the kind of person who deserves to go to jail for the crime that he was caught committing, right? So how do these beliefs translate into very, very serious downstream consequences? Okay. I also, sorry, this is going a little bit longer, Jen, than what I showed you, but I'm gonna keep going if that's okay. So I also show them then because I think it's important. So obviously very, very heavy stuff. And I think it's important to the extent that you are able to remind your students that there is some kind of good in the world, right? So I also tell them a little bit about Chanel Miller's victim impact statement. I don't know if anybody read this when it came out, but BuzzFeed published it, and it is heartbreaking but incredibly necessary writing, where she reflects on how she was treated and all of the questions that were asked of her, right, compared to how her assailant was treated, right? And then I end all of this because, again, very important to realize along the lines of like life happens, right? The things that you talk about, like should you choose to talk about real world issues like this, these are not like abstract philosophical examples. Like your students, a staggering percentage of your students, specifically at USC, close to 1 in 3 female undergraduates by the time they graduate, my God, are going to have personal experience with this very thing, right? So talking about these issues in a way that is sensitive of that fact is crucially important. So I actually quote part of Chanel Miller's victim impact statement. And she says something, I have this memorized too. She says something to the effect, I hope I don't butcher this, but basically like lighthouses don't go looking around for boats to save. They just kind of stand there shining, right? And she draws this beautiful analogy that I really would rather not be here, but if I'm in this situation, I'm gonna be a lighthouse and I'm gonna tell my story in the hopes that it encourages someone else to feel a little bit better and a little bit more empowered than they otherwise did. And that tends to mean a great deal to people, and I'll put it that way. All right, so here's the example now. This is where we're gonna play along. So what I want you to do, I'll read this to yourselves and I'll read it out loud, and then I'll have some questions about this for you. So this is from the New York Times. I'm gonna show you 2 examples. It's from the New York Times describing a person. And the New York Times wrote, He was no angel, with public records and interviews with friends and family revealing both problems and promise in his young life. He lived in a community that had rough patches, and he dabbled in drugs and alcohol. He had taken to rapping in recent months, producing lyrics that were by turns contemplative and vulgar. He got into at least one scuffle with a neighbor. Okay, so I read that and I ask all of my students, okay, what kind of impressions do you get about the person that is being described? And that's the question I'll pose to all of you.
I'll go. So it sounds like they're trying to say that this person, while, you know, this person's future could have been bright, that the decisions that were made were ended up putting him in a bad place, and that he's a bad person. I mean, they're talking about using drugs and alcohol, scuffling, vulgarity. They're using a lot of words that give you that impression that this is a bad person.
Yeah, you are
not a lot of
not
positivity there.
Yeah, you are not to be left with the impression that this is a particularly upstanding person, is the general consensus, right? And I specifically asked that question very broadly, what impressions do we get of this person? And people, I mean, they don't hide it. It's like unanimously pretty clear. We're not supposed to think particularly well of this person. So I let the students kind of answer that out loud. And then I specifically tell them that if you already know this, because the phrase no angel got really famous because of this specific passage. So I tell people, if you recognize the no angel line and you know who this is describing, please don't spoil. But then I ask everybody, all right, who do we think this is describing? And they describe pretty awful, I forget the specific examples that people give for this one, but they describe people that go along with those lines of, this is not a person we should emulate, this is not a person we should admire, et cetera, and they prove the point. Then I do the reveal and I tell them that this passage was written by the New York Times about Michael Brown, who's the teenager who's killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, a couple years ago, whose death sparked the Black Lives Matter movement several years back. That was written by the New York Times about Michael Brown the night before his family was set to bury him. Right? So imagine, and I specifically say this to my students, imagine losing a family member in such an awful, horrific way, only to have them be described like that as some kind of like matter of like national debate. Like that's awful. So I give them that example, and then we do another one. As you will note, this is also the New York Times, same outlet. The New York Times again writes about a person. People familiar with his early years say he was a Boy Scout, a B+ college student. He loved children, read poetry, and was a rising figure in Republican politics in Seattle. He was the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Like, thanks, dude, I guess. So again, I'm so done, I'm sorry. So again, I pose the same questions to my students. All right, so what kind of impressions should we get about this person? What do we think, my students?
This person sounds upstanding, civically minded, active in the community. Sounds like they're going to be a good role model.
A good role model, someone to emulate and look up to, right? And again, I choose these examples for a reason. It's very clear that that is the conclusion to be drawn, right? And out in the audience at this point, I see people's wheels turning about where I'm going with this. So then I asked for guesses, and people do not disappoint. People have been like, oh, it's Harvey Weinstein, or oh, it's Brett Kavanaugh, or something like that. And every time I'm like, that's an excellent guess, but no, because who this was describing, my friends, was Ted Bundy. A number of students are familiar with who Ted Bundy is, so I have to clarify. One of the most notorious mass murderers in American history. Specifically, the New York Times wrote this about Ted Bundy the night before he was set to be executed by the state of Florida. Just to give you like kind of a comparison, both of those passages were written in immediate chronological proximity to a person dying in very different circumstances, but look at how they were both portrayed and ask yourself, why that might be the case. I've gone on for quite a while, so I'm not going to show you any more examples, but I have more examples that I show my students as time permits. And basically the way I frame it is, I'm so sorry, but this is something you are never going to be able to unsee, that this framing occurs all of the time. And now I'm just giving you the academic language to describe what I know you have already noticed. That's enough Ted Bundy. We're done with Ted Bundy. Bye, Ted Bundy. But that's my speech there. Yeah, did you have any questions about that? Is that how this works, that you like ask me questions about it?
So we can ask questions or comments now, but I think we usually hold those until the end after we've like done all the showing, if that makes sense.
Perfect. I'm done then. Thank you.
If everyone's cool with waiting. Those were great examples, and I really enjoyed hearing them again. I know some of them I already heard, but
yeah. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yes.
Your TED Talk?
Oh, I didn't mean that. Oh,
but it was too good.
Funny. Pun not intended. All right. So I think we can move on to our last section, because I think, Molly, the stuff you wanted to talk about next was like a couple assignments that you had. Is that, or did you have content stuff to share as well?
Nah, I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
I know the assignment stuff you wanted to share sounded really great. So
yeah. So I don't have any like interesting slides or anything. I'm happy to like email you my documents, but it's not going to be pretty to pop up on the screen, but I can tell you about the problem I was trying to solve, which is for my close relationships class, which is the content course I've taught the most. It was the first course I ever taught as a grad student, and I've taught it at every institution I've been at, and one of my absolute favorites to teach. And sorry, words are hard, but that's actually what my t-shirt says. Words are real hard.
Oh, I need that.
So close relationships, it's my area of expertise. I love teaching this class, just like every other class we teach. There's no way we can ever cover all the things that we want to do. And as much as I love the class, I've really struggled with framing the course, because the syllabi and the textbooks that are out there, especially when I started teaching this in 2012, are super duper heteronormative and very marriage centric. And so like, my strategy has been from the beginning to, use the book that students like the most, the ones that they like confess that they read on purpose because they just like, they kept going because it was so interesting and exciting. And then supplement where necessary. So from the second time I taught it, I've always included a unit on monogamy and consensual non-monogamy, and cited the work of, Dr. Amy Moores and colleagues. And I have taught about sex in relationships, which actually doesn't have a prominent place in a lot of relationships textbooks. And I've always tried to at least address like some myth busting about gay and lesbian relationships, but there actually isn't, or at least then hardly any research looking specifically at gay relationships and how they're unique. In fact, one of the parts of the textbook that I use, which is still my absolute favorite, there's a little text insert in the introduction in the first chapter saying, first of all, don't forget that just because anything that I talk about in here doesn't necessarily apply to you, that doesn't mean it's not true, right? That just because it doesn't apply to an individual doesn't mean that that's not a general pattern that we found, blah, blah, blah. Then he also goes on to write this passage about research on gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships. And in what I think was intended to be a super supportive, encouraging way of framing it, he basically says, like, there's very little research on it, but what we do know is that the relationships of gay men and lesbians are almost the same as relationships of straight people, right? Love is love. And so, there's no reason to like spend a lot of effort and energy distinguishing between them because they're basically the same. Which I think he had the best of intentions in framing it like this. And there certainly, isn't evidence that like basic attraction processes happen fundamentally differently or attachment is fundamentally different. but that completely ignores the social context and the legal context that these relationships exist in. And I've heard from students that they always felt like kind of offended by that passage, but like they weren't supposed to be offended because it sounded so nice, but they felt erased. And so even the best example of resources I could find still left my students feeling this. Related, I often get questions about, well, is this how it works in other cultures? Is this the same process in gay relationships? And there are some things that I know, of course, many more that I don't. And after so many years of teaching this class, I got really tired of answering that question with, that's a really great question. You should research it and tell me more. Or that sounds like a great topic for your final paper. Let's find out together. And I still think that those are decent ways of handling that kind of question because we can't possibly teach all of the things. But I got really tired of not being able to answer their questions and being kind of hand wavy about the fact that the published textbooks and materials, and I mean, frankly, most of the literature doesn't address the diversity in human experiences. So 2 years ago, I started a new assignment in my relationships course. And the assignment is building a more inclusive textbook. So one of my hallmarks in my upper level classes is I will never, ever, ever have them write another research proposal for as long as I live. Everyone else assigns that. I get to do more fun things because they're already getting that practice elsewhere. So in my class, they are to write a new chapter for our textbook. And so we use our textbook as a model, which does have a lot of great things about it. And throughout the term, we, do little workshops and focus on textbook features and how is this different from a journal article, and talk about the medium and what's included and what's not included and so on. But each student is, they sign up for one combination of underrepresented sample in the literature and primary topic that's covered by the textbook. So I use the main topics that are chapters in my textbook as well as other things that I've included. And then the samples are gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships, trans and genderqueer individuals, culture, thinking of it as like East-West dichotomy, as well as culture and social class as culture, which has been rising area of research in social psych, especially out of Californian institutions over the last 10 years or so. Interracial relationships or intercultural relationships, as well as relationships with those in other races. In addition, age, because the relationships of older adults are often glossed over in our textbooks. And so each student is basically ultimately signs up for one combination of both of those things. So they might write about sex and sexuality in older adults, or attraction in dating in gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships, or monogamy and non-monogamy across cultures. So their job is to do a literature review on this research, but in the style of a textbook, so that we could, conceivably insert it into the textbook that they're already assigned. I love about this assignment that it gives them the opportunity to research a topic and a sample that's meaningful to them. I love that it's a literature review, but with a level up, right? Because by definition, these are underrepresented samples. So I'm basically guaranteeing from the beginning that these are going to be hard papers to find. And so it requires a little bit more search magic in order to know if there's anything out there or not to even be reviewing. I also recommend that they explicitly compare and contrast the research on, the research that is purported to be universal, that's cited in our textbooks, and the research that they find, and to talk about why or why not, or that's an appropriate conclusion to draw, what the limitations are of researching this sample, why it has or has not been included in the literature up until this point, and so on. And so My dream, in the after times, I don't know when that is, when I have time and energy, whatever that means, is to actually turn this project into an open educational resource. So I've also been getting a lot more interested in the last couple of years in OERs, not just in assigning them, but in developing them. And so having students generate open material and like being authors on their own textbook in this style, I would love to do to make it just, a little bit more meaningful. I've done a blogging assignment in my class too, and they love that public element of it. It's scary and also really fun. And so I'd like to do that with this assignment as well. But I regularly, there's always, some students who don't like it because it's really hard. But I regularly get pretty positive feedback on this assignment, that it's the first assignment that they've ever done that like explicitly had them explore research on underrepresented samples, oftentimes in samples that are relevant to their own lives. University of Toronto is one of the most multicultural, diverse universities in the world. Toronto is one of the most multicultural cities in the world. And so giving my students the opportunity to see themselves or their families reflected in the research is really important to me as well. So that's one assignment that I have been working real hard on, and each term gets a little better. One day, maybe it'll be public for sharing.
That's awesome. That's really great. I know we talked about that briefly a little bit in the thing, so that was really nice to hear more. That was awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so are we ready to open it up for comments? Bob, Sierra, questions, comments?
Sure, I have a comment and a question. We'll go back to the very beginning when we talked about policy. I think that the policy you have, the Life Happens policy, is really awesome. And one of the things that I think is really important about it is that there's no need for excuses or reasons. And so I'm curious, what your thoughts are on that, because I've noticed that in my class, I have something similar. I give students opportunities 3 times in the course to request an extension or to ask for a new attempt on an assignment, a new revision on an assignment, no questions asked. But I find it hard sometimes to get the students who most need that to actually go, yeah, you're right. And so it sounds like you tried with your language, but what advice would you have to make sure that every student actually believes you?
I like the way you phrase that, because that's something that I've struggled with a lot in general. And I feel like a lot more this term, that like they don't believe these policies, or like I had an open book untimed online stats exam last week. Still grading it. Don't know how that went. We'll see. But like the number of panicked emails I got confirming all of these details that were explicitly laid out in multiple documents, because they didn't believe it. They're like, there's a trick somewhere. I must be missing something. There's no way. So all that to say, it's a constant struggle, and I don't know that I've solved it. One thing so there are a couple things that I do. So part of it is that it's in my syllabus. I make sure and I take time to talk about it on the first day. That is not one of those policies that I let just kind of like hide in the legalese of my syllabus, that I make sure to make a big deal out of it. And I have a really specific procedure about how to do it so that it's not a mystery. I try to be as clear as possible. I also, in how I respond to students when they do email me, I try to remind them that this is something that they are all entitled to. Like already this term, a student asked to use the late ticket on one of the early homework sets, problem sets for stats, and spent time in their email apologizing for having to use it so soon. I'm like, stop it, like cut it out, stop apologizing. You don't, like, this is not an inconvenience to me. This is something that you are entitled to. And so both in the way that I talk about it to my class, I write it about in my syllabus, and the way that I interact with them individually, I try to be really annoying about reiterating just how much they are not an inconvenience to me. I like, it takes time. It helps that by the time I have them in upper level class, I've had almost all of them in stats. And so it's not unfamiliar at that point. So that helps a lot. Another thing that I do, and this I know isn't right for everyone, but I'm really transparent with my students about when I'm having a hard time. Not all the time, you know, I don't like rant about my bad day constantly. But, you know, I'll say after a particularly bad week, I don't even remember exactly what it was because there've been so many over the last few years, but my first year here, something had happened in the US that just really left me feeling shook. And so, and I teach stats at night, and I didn't have it in me. And I said, like, I just want you guys to know, like, this is something I'm dealing with. So if I'm tripping over my words tonight, like, I'm finding it a lot harder to put thoughts together, and they really appreciate that. When there's a tragedy on campus, I take time to talk about it. We've had a high frequency of student suicides of the last couple of years, and I take time out of class to talk about it. Last year, I had to cancel class. No, 2 years ago now, I had to cancel class for a panic attack, and I told them that that's what it was for. And they're just like shocked that like someone with the position of power like deals with those things, which I feel like to us sounds crazy. Like, of course we do. And so my transparency with them, I think, supports their willingness to be open with me when they need something. And that's an important part of rapport building for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're doing is you're keeping the focus on learning, because one of the things that kind of frustrates me is when you look at someone's grade and you recognize that the vast majority of it has nothing to do with learning. It really has to do with conscientiousness or crisis or other things that are happening.
Right. And it's certainly, like, we can't disentangle that entirely, but to the extent that we can minimize the role of that in the assessments.
Yeah, definitely. I really resonated with me what you said, Molly, about just being really honest and transparent with students about your, things that you're doing. Just earlier this semester, we had a fall break that was like 2 days at the end of a week. And I was like, you know what, everybody, we all need a break. I wasn't really prepared for the week. I was like, we're all taking this week off. Like, the whole week in this class, you have it off. I'm going to adjust. I was like, I'm stressed. You guys are stressed, overwhelmed. Let's all just take a break. And I was surprised at the number of students who said thank you. And it's really appreciative. I had a student write me a really nice response about how appreciative of it she was, and that she wanted to acknowledge that. And it was just really fabulous. And so especially this semester, where everybody's overwhelmed so much as it is, and all my classes got pushed online, so students are taking stats online, and they weren't ready for that. And, I've just been really honest about, like, even just today, I emailed my students and said, you know what, after having that extended fall break, we were behind. I tried to push too much this week. You know what? I was on Twitter, I was on my Facebook teaching groups. Yes, I have those. And I was reminded, like, I get to decide what we cover in this class, and it's okay. Like, I'm going to make some changes because this is too much for you guys. And I want to give you time, and I don't think it's fair for me to ask you to do all this stuff right now. So I admitted my mistake in not really thinking about how much work I was making them do, and trying to show that I was thinking about flexibility and trying to be compassionate and understanding about their situations, because I could tell students were getting stressed already, and it was only Wednesday today. So yeah,
it's amazing. It's amazing how much grace they will grant us if we just show a little ourselves.
Leslie, I have a question for you.
Oh yeah, I was actually going to say, can I add something to this before we move on about policies? Yeah. So I think, Molly, you raised a bunch of important points in terms of, like, being essentially real with your students about, like, when you're having a hard time, right? And you mentioned that like disclosure isn't for everyone, right? In terms of the level of detail that we're individually comfortable providing. And then of course, there's a boundary for everyone, what is versus isn't appropriate, right? That being said, everyone's gonna have a different level of comfort, but I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind that no matter what it is you are specifically disclosing, the idea of humanizing yourself is really, really, really important. So one way that I do that personally, so there's actually data suggesting that when the study was on high school students, but specifically when teenagers learn about famous scientists who have struggled as a result, or not as a result, but who have struggled en route to becoming the famous scientists that they are, Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, Michael Faraday, etc. When they read a little vignette of saying, hey, this person struggled, whether professionally, personally, whatever, they do better at science post-intervention relative to pre-intervention without any other kind of science tutoring or anything academic related. They do better simply by knowing that, hey, other people can struggle too. And these effects are most pronounced for students who are already lowest performing to begin with.
So good.
So I think that kind of, I'm sorry, Molly?
Sorry, I just said it's so good. I love that study.
Yeah, so wait, I got more. So what I do, this is my tradition, so this looks different in person versus online. So I'll describe the in-person version. But basically what I would do is every class, they get their first exam, right? And they're all multiple choice. So they can be graded relatively quickly. But for the first exam, what I say is, you're not gonna get these back until class starts next time. And I unhide the column on Blackboard immediately before I start talking, so that I can tell them this story and they can hear this story and see their grade at the same time. But basically, I tell them a version of my own struggle story where I, honest to God, in organic chemistry, sophomore year of college, as you can tell, I am not an organic chemist. I got grades on those exams that, let me tell you, below freezing is a generous term. Awful, awful. So, have any of y'all taken organic chemistry? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I feel you so much. I was so blessed that he gave us a curve, because I would never have passed that class without a curve.
No curve would have saved me. But point being, for those not familiar, my Bath and Body Works is the only prop I have. But basically, organic chemistry requires you somehow to like rotate physically these molecules. You have to have really good spatial reasoning, and I don't. So I tell my students, I have never worked harder at anything in my life than I have at organic chemistry, and nothing, right? And I add on to this story and say, for some reason, and I have these, I call them my bad teacher speeches, where I just roast awful teaching practices that I know they have been exposed to because I've been exposed to them. And I think it's important for them to hear, again, from a person in authority, like, this is not okay. So in one of my bad teacher speeches, I tell them that this organic chemistry professor, for reasons unbeknownst to me as a professional educator, I'm looking back, like, how was that appropriate? This professor thought it was appropriate to not only announce the average score on the exam, but also announce the lowest score on the exam. Guess who had that lowest score and had an entire auditorium laugh at her at the prospect of how someone could be this bad at something? Isn't that awful? So I tell them the story specifically to be like, if you have ever gotten the lowest grade on something and you've been that person, so am I, and I'm doing fine now. It is okay, and everything, like, it sucks in the moment, but it will be okay. And I think that's really important for people to hear. I have people coming back semesters and years later being like, I remember that story, and I'm in organic chemistry now. Thank you for telling that story.
Add to that, because I think it's a really great thing to talk about, and how struggle. One of the things that I'm going to plug a book here. It's called Eureka by Chad Orzel, and it's like a popular science book. But basically the entire book is like, science is things that you already do. Like, we already all do science. It's look, think, test, tell. Like, that's what science is. And it talks about, and I have a lot of my students read the introduction of that book, because it is so powerful to hear that you're already doing, if you play any kind of mobile game on your phone, Candy Crush, Angry Birds, any of those, you're doing science. Like, you're thinking about it, you have to figure out those strategies, all that kind of stuff. That's science. If you play video games, if you cook, if you do all these things, and the whole book is essentially about that. And and it even has a little statement that says, scientists are not smarter than everybody else. And I just assigned that in one of my classes, and the comments that students were making, it was like, wow, I wish I knew this earlier. I wish I knew that, you know, I'm a science, like that stigma that comes with science and things like that is really harmful. It really prevents people from exploring things that they're interested in because they think they're bad at science or bad at math or whatever they're bad at. And so it's just such a powerful thing. And I love that you're doing something very similar, just in a different way. And I like, that's so cool.
I have so much more to say about this. I realized Bob started by asking me a different question. I can give you like a brief preview of where I'm thinking to segue off of what Sierra just said. But I have a whole like spiel that I give on the first day of class about what science is, what a scientist looks like, the images that we have in our head of, if you're familiar with like the Draw a Scientist test that they have children do. And I have this whole speech that I give. I can reenact that, or we can go to Bob's question. Bob, what was your question?
Oh, you can, well, I'll go ahead. This is kind of related. One of the things that I wanted to ask is, you know, I love the discussion of belief in a just world. It seems like a nice way to segue ultimately into some really challenging discussions, and also to reconnect to, you know, early childhood, attachment, all kinds of things, adverse childhood events, everything. But one of the things that I've recently discovered, I've been teaching and trying to teach, introduce anti-racism in my honors general psych class. And the first semester, last semester, it was just dynamite. And this semester it was really good. But one of the things that happened is the students really wanted to have more dialogue about it, and they didn't know how to do that. And they really reached a point where they were ready to be more open. I'm in Tennessee. There's a lot of folks that were not exposed to some of the anti-racism material, literature, ideas ever. And so they're ready to talk about it. I'm just curious, when you're in that stage, you're ready to talk about something, how do you recommend that other people start those conversations safely so that students can, you know, work through some of their issues and concerns, but you can kind of diffuse some of the things that happen when people get too overeager too quickly and maybe say things they shouldn't say?
Sure. So my general approach is that this is something like, if we want to have conversations like I have, or at least get students thinking about ideas that I'm going to be throwing out here, right? That's not something that I can just like waltz into the classroom one day and be like, hey, we're doing this today, right? So much thought has to go into this from day one and prior to day one, right? So something that I have always done when I was teaching like smaller classes of my own, like as a graduate student, and now I outsource it to my TAs for their lab sections for intro psych. But basically what I do is I have my students do a community guidelines activity on the very first day of class, where I have, you know, the big, the giant sticky notes, right? What's the English word, Leslie? An easel, right? A giant easel of the sticky notes, and I bring markers and stickers, and it's art time. And it's both a kind of team building exercise. They break them up into groups of like 3 or 4. They get to know each other in a way. I hate icebreakers so much. This is one of my pet peeves. I hate them so much. So this is a good way that I think is nice and authentic and not artificial to like meet other people and talk with other people. And more specifically, what we're talking about is each group, I want you to come up with, I call them basically rules for good human conduct. If you are telling a story, if you're sharing your opinion, how would you want other people to treat you? Likewise, if someone else is sharing their story, sharing their opinion, whatever, how should you treat them, right? And I have students, so some people do not like this, and these are also people who I have a feeling just have general feelings about me as a person. That's a separate conversation, but what I need to say is that some people are like, isn't that like kindergarten? Let me tell you, students love this so much. Because I tell them, I'm like, y'all can like go nuts, like come up with puns, do acrostic poems, do comics, and they get into it and they love it. Then what we do is we have, and everything serves a purpose. So when they're done 10, 15 minutes making their art, doing whatever, they then get to share with the rest of the class, right? And the specific instruction that I give my TAs at this point is, I want to hear words, or you should be hearing words out of every single person's mouth so that they get used to saying things in this environment, knowing no one's going to make fun of you, no one's going to be awful, because we literally just spent the past 10 to 15 minutes talking about how to be decent people, right, to each other. So I don't have those slides open way back here right now, but I can find a sample list for you if you'd like to see them. But basically, off the top of my head, basic things like obviously like don't interrupt, but other things like, what's one of them? I just like crowdsource a list that we just add to. Empathize, don't minimize is one. So for example, if someone is sharing a concern that maybe doesn't mean anything to you, it doesn't mean it's less real for them, right? Another one about, we call it step forward, step back. So the idea that if you're one of the people who tends to like to hear the sound of your own voice, right, and you just keep talking, be the person who then kind of steps back and waits a second before jumping in to answer every question, right? That kind of thing. Other things, and this is also just in facilitating this activity, is also a really good exercise in science. And I specifically make that point when I'm like visiting around groups, or I have TAs visit the group and rotate. If a student says, be nice, and that's one of their things, then we get to have a really good discussion about operationalizing variables. What does it mean to be nice? Unpack that for me, right? So it's a really good, I get so many things done with this. It's a really good demonstration of, we can talk about basic decency and have fun with stickers and also do science at the same time, right? And in doing panels and workshops and consults, et cetera, all around the country, I have heard so many horror stories from people who decide, and I mean, good for them, that they decide it's really important to talk about these issues, but they haven't maybe, I don't want to sound awful, but they haven't maybe put the thought that's necessary into it to do it really well. I've heard so many horror stories, and I am so lucky that I have never had something like that happen in my career, which I attribute to these guidelines that we do on the very first day of class, because people not only know how they're going to comport themselves, but they have ownership in these guidelines that they've come up with. So I will die on the community guidelines hill for the rest of my life. But did that more or less answer that? It needs to be a preemptive
that's
approach
perfect.
in every way.
Exactly what I was hoping to hear. So that's really perfect for folks that want to consider doing some of the practices. It's not like they can just borrow your slides, start having these difficult conversations, right?
Right.
Well, and I just want to follow up by saying in my smaller classes, I do very similar things, because just by nature of the courses I teach, close relationships, sex and gender, and intergroup relations, like, we're gonna talk about stuff that makes people uncomfortable, but it's important and it can be really empowering, but if we do it right. And so I also spend time on first days generating these community guidelines, with trying to focus on behaviors as opposed to, intentions and things like that. And I will also say that there's something powerful about spending class time on it, right? So you often hear that if you want to get students to do something, you have to do it for a grade, right? Like, that's, or assign points to it. That's how they understand that you value it. But also, if you spend time on it in class, then they know it's actually important. So I feel like there's a very big difference between having these guidelines on your syllabus and like spending a couple minutes talking about it, as opposed to spending 10, 20 minutes doing this type of activity. Really communicates that you mean it. That you mean it, that we're going to do this right, and you mean it that we're going to do this at all, and you're not just paying lip service to talking about these concepts in your classes.
Okay, and here those are. I found the slides in case anybody wants to take a quick peek at them. And if you have any questions about what these mean, go ahead and let me know.
Oh, this is awesome. Thank you for sharing this.
Oh, that's lovely.
Of course.
Yeah, so it sounds like you really need to build the relationship and have that trust of your students before you can have these conversations. I really like what you were doing, Molly, with the building your own inclusive curriculum. One of the things I wish we could do more of is since more of us are using ebooks, even with the publishers, I wish it were more possible to even annotate those and have students share some of those kinds of experiences, and maybe even have a requirement to add notes into the textbook to refer to things that maybe ought to be shared.
I do a lot of that stuff, Bob, but I am restricted to, I have to use OER because I usually just put it out like as a Google Doc, and then we use free hypothesis accounts to annotate, but um, they're annotating and asking questions and bringing together various things. And I've done that in a couple different classes. And I think students get a lot of use out of being able to comment. And one of the things that they're allowed to do is make your own example, bring in a resource that helps you better understand this. And so now we have this collection of videos and examples that help explain concepts in the book that they either found interesting or struggled with. And now everybody in the class gets that thing. And like, isn't that useful? We're all studying together. We're all in class together. Instead of keeping it to one person, everybody gets it. And that's something I think is super awesome. And that's one of the things I really love about having OER.
Well, I love that. And that's one thing that's still missing from my assignment that I haven't figured out a way to do this well, because my semesters are only 12 weeks long. And so I just feel so starved for time with my students and making sure they have enough time to like do a thing, get feedback, try again, write a draft, etc. But we draft these, or they write these chapters. And that's part of why I'd really like to move toward this open publishing model, because I want them to be able to see each other's things too. So the first time I did the assignment, after they all wrote their individual sections, I then put them into small groups that were thematically arranged and had them write a master chapter based on all their sections. So like, for example, I took all the 4 students who all wrote on some individual topic related to gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships and had them merge them together into one chapter on the relationships of gay men, lesbians, and bisexual people. And like, it was nice. It was nice to have that like master thing. It gave them a chance to see at least a few things that their classmates had learned about that they wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to. But because of how the end of semester feels, I talked to a couple students who I had good relationships with after, and they said like, I see what you were going for, but it kind of just felt like another hurdle, and we didn't really get to enjoy seeing what our classmates did. And so that's something that is still missing from my assignment, is a way to not only have that experience for themselves, but then also learn from all the other things that their classmates learned too.
Yeah.
Well, this was awesome. I really enjoyed this episode. I don't know about you all, but I feel like I learned a lot, even though I feel like I'm not doing things. I know exactly. I was taking notes.
It's not real life if it's not on a Post-it. I have them all over.
True. All right. Well, I think we are, if anyone else, unless anyone else want to make a last minute comment, I think we're ready to wrap up here. Wrapping up episode 2.
Yeah, we're so grateful to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, Leslie and Molly. This was really great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.